keep things moving. So, Jonathyne, as you're stepping to the podium, I'll welcome you. Jonathyne Briggs currently teaches at Indiana University Northwest, where he's an associate professor of history. Some great news for Jonathyne is that his book, Sounds French, Globalization, Cultural Communities, and Pop Music, 1958 to 1980, is currently under contract with Oxford University Press. Which is good news for all of us. And in the interest of time, I will not go through his many fascinating publications in other places, although I have to say this title out loud: The Pothead Pixies, Drug Utopias in the Music of Gong, 1969 to 1974, which is not even the most recent nor the most illustrious of his publications, and yet how could I resist sharing that title with you? So, Jonathyne, as I said, we really want to hear more of you and get to conversation afterwards, so take it away. Johnny Alarmé, Nationalist Visions of Youth in the Era of Decolonization.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to the panel for agreeing to, one, come here and to get up this early, and to break the wall for a bit. Thank you to David Smith for recording this for posterity, I suppose. Thank you. On 10th May 1964, the most famous young person in France at the time, Jean-Philippe Smet, began his national service with the French army. Like many other men his age, national service was part of the obligation of growing up in French society, and Smet agreed to serve for his adopted home's armed forces, following in a sense in the footsteps of his idol, Elvis Presley. Smet, known more under his stage name of Johnny Hallyday, had an intensely covered tour of duty in the French army, assigned to the 43rd Armored Regiment in Offenburg, West Germany. Ironically enough, the same country where Elvis served his time for the United States. Hallyday's activities with the regiment were documented in national news and youth media, including a regular column attributed to Halliday in the pages of the youth monthly Salut les Copains. The timing of his service came at the peak of his early career, when Halliday's recordings had sold millions of copies in France and solidified youth culture as a significant aspect of the continued economic miracle of the 1960s. When asked about his feelings towards the Army in 1964, he championed its importance. Quote, "For me, national service opens a window on the everyday world," end quote. Halliday was not alone in responding positively to the demands of military obligations, as other French rock and rollers completed their mandatory service in the early 1960s, precisely during the winding down of the French Army's involvement in Algeria. The Army's conduct during that war led to its sobriquet as La Guerre Sale, the Dirty War, especially as reports of torture and atrocities reached the public, and fostered a vigorous debate over the schism between the rhetoric of French values and the actions of its military. This debate was intensified by the increased presence of young soldiers in Algeria. Unlike the other limited wars of the post-war period, the war in Algeria necessitated the use of conscripts, thanks to the strategic commitment of the Fourth Republic. By the early 1960s, this need motivated many young people to unify against the war, further damaging the prestige of the military. Halliday's service, which came after the end of the hostilities in Algeria, marked a change in the way that youth culture engaged with the experience of the military, which was still then considered a rite of passage for young men. The framing of Halliday as a symbol of French nationalism illustrates how the French reconceptualized military service after Algeria, which dovetails into parallel reconceptualizations of the imperial experience. This is Todd Shepard's work, of course, and the changing meaning of military service for young men. Halliday's stationing in West Germany speaks to the European turn of the French military, and the media coverage emphasized the continued strength of French nationalism even after Algeria. This paper will examine the role that images of Halliday played in this public transformation of the French military at the end of the era of decolonization. The position of youth in the military remained constant during the 20th century with the continuation of the French government's policy of conscription. Mandatory service for all young men had begun with the capital R Revolution, serving as a way to link citizens to the new state. And Eugene Weber has famously noted, as we all have read many times, I'm sure, the importance of the army as a method of building national identity in the late 19th century. The human cost of the two world wars required the continuation of conscription even after 1945, although military action in Indochina was conducted primarily by volunteers. However, the Algerian conflict required a military force of over 3,000 soldiers, with conscripts making up nearly 80% of the total, as terms of military service were extended beyond 2 years. George Flynn notes the importance of a number of draftees and their social class in creating an anti-war movement within the ranks. Divisions within the army between those who were skeptical but loyal to the command, and the growing movement against the government within the paratroopers created chaos and contributed to conscripts rejecting their orders of the regular officers during the Algerian conflict. The disenchantment with the war was not limited to young people within the military. As the conflict escalated in 1958, dozens of youth organizations protested against the war, invoking the image of France's youth being forced to fight a war chosen by its adults. Richard I. Jobs argues that this rhetoric of generational conflict was in reaction to domestic debates concerning Algeria, providing a method for young people to intervene in political debates. Youth interest in political engagement rested on the importance of young men in the military, and the protest against the war reveals a suspicion of the overt nationalism previously associated with conscription. Many youth groups came out solidly against the actions in Algeria, including Jeune Resistance, which spearheaded a movement to support those seeking to evade the draft for reasons of conscience. Even within the military, questions about French nationalism arose following the actions of the army during the war, especially concerning the future role of the military in French society, even though President Charles de Gaulle wanted to continue this policy. Nevertheless, conscription remained a reality for the millions of young men in France and had long been considered the rite of passage to mark their entry into adulthood. Traditionally, the army provided young men with social modeling for acceptable masculine behavior and, quote unquote, a measure of virility. Christophe Gracieux, he asserts the importance of entry rituals during the 1950s in an effort to maintain this perception of military service. However, by the early 1960s, such rituals were on the wane, especially with the increased experience of higher education for young people and the development of a distinct youth culture in the post-war period. Moreover, military officials recognized that conscripts did not have the same sense of patriotism, thanks in large part, they argued, to the difficulties of the Algerian War. Critics of conscription noted that, quote, military service is conceived by draftees as a period now of irresponsibility, end quote. These factors changed the centrality of mandatory service in young men's lives, and the rituals themselves would change as the army reoriented its purpose after Algerian independence in 1962. Nevertheless, the notion of universal service remained a central aspect of de Gaulle's vision of the French military after Algeria, even as other shared experience eclipsed the social centrality of conscription for young men. One of the major challenges to this was the development of an autonomous form of youth culture represented by the popularity of rock and roll music in France. Coinciding with the end of the Algerian War, Jamie, I'm sorry, could you forward that for me? The button over here. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much. You just push like enter, I think, and it will go. Thank you. Okay. Coinciding with the end of the Algerian War in March of 1962 was the appearance of the first issue of Salut les copains in the summer of that year, with a very youthful Johnny Hallyday smiling out at us here on the cover. And I am poor Vince Taylor, by the way. I'm very poor Vince Taylor. The magazine was a companion to the popular afternoon radio show hosted by Daniel Philippacci on Europe 1 that introduced rock and roll to French listeners and fostered the careers of young French stars such as Hallyday. The publication was an immediate success, quickly reaching sales of 1 million copies per issue and becoming the centerpiece of French youth culture. The culture of the copains that the magazine presented was one of a vibrant youth that embraced consumerism and leisure within the context that was divorced from politics. While there's an awareness of Frenchness in the pages of the magazine, the overt nationalism perhaps we would associate with Gaullism is not evident, nor is the generational divide manifested during the Algerian War. Instead, Philippacci states in his editorial in the first issue that the divisions of French society can be healed through rock and roll music, which unifies young and old alike, at least as he liked to believe by interpreting his audience numbers. Quote, for the first time in a world created and run by those over 20, those under 20 have a right to speak. And as a result, this is not so bad since the recent statistics prove that the show's audience is equally made of those over the age of 20 and often, simply put, parents, end quote. So the idea here is that everybody loves this show. Philippacci saw the youth culture of the copains as a method of bringing together French society during a difficult transition. In the pages of Salut les copains, Philippe Paci maintained what we might call a non-political approach. This often drew criticism from other youth magazines. Even French youth magazines are in debates. So anyway, I'm fascinated by the jazz debates here. However, this did not mean that Salut les copains avoided politics altogether, particularly the politics of national identity, so important during the 1960s. One issue that certainly concerned the readers of Salut les copains was that of mandatory service. The damage done to the prestige of the military was countered by a slant within the pages of the magazine that emphasized the importance of service as a responsibility of the copains, but not, of course, the copines, which we can certainly talk about as well. Holiday service would play a central role in the regular column called La Lettre de Johnny, which had been part of the magazine since its inception. But even before the beginning of its tenure, writers of Salut les copains made discussions of military service part of its coverage of youth culture. For example, André Arnaud's April 1964 piece, Copain Flash, begins with the discussion of the Beatle George Harrison, who I figure you might know, his recent 18th birthday, and how he was not required to do mandatory service in Great Britain. Arnaud uses this point as a springboard to discuss the importance of the military in French society. Quote, il ne se peut qu'un jour la France, elle aussi, se contente d'armées volontaires. La conception de l'armée n'est pas la même ici et là, la caractère anglais et français différente. Right, so he's kind of talking about the importance of the French army as part of the character of France here. Plus, I don't think he liked Harrison's haircut. Arnaud's insistence on the distinct meaning of military service for the French character harkened back to the traditional ideas seemingly damaged during the Algerian War. Although he recognizes that the military mission was changing, he said perhaps one day there will be an army of volunteers. Arnaud still notes the state of conscription as the reality in France, and his emphasis on the need for young men, including the teen idols of in the pages of Salut les copains, to fulfill their patriotic duty, illustrates the magazine's desire to promote military service as a social norm. The image of Holiday, which was critical to the success of Salut les copains, was transformed in May of 1964. Thank you. Here we are. When he was placed on the cover yet again. However, this time Holiday, as we can see here, is dressed in his military fatigues, and of course strategically placed in front of the tricolore, serving as a symbol for the reality of military service in the lives of young men. His pose and facial expression, of course, you can see he's very serious here as opposed to before. And again, in terms of this contrast, the difference between the two echoes this kind of narrative of military service as a pathway to adulthood, providing regular readers with an image that matches the traditional conception of military service. During Haliday's tour, the magazine made it a point to alert readers to content that would cover his military life. For example, in the July 1964 cover, it promised Johnny en caserne inside, right? So exciting. Chris Tinker argues that the Holiday coverage reinforced stereotypes of masculinity through the image of the quote-unquote manly soldier. But certainly another part that I want to point out here of these stereotypes is the underscoring of the traditional relationship between military and the pathway to adulthood. If we can go on. This is afterwards, of course. You can see he's not in his military uniform now. So the pronounced placement of his beret, you can see it here. It's touching him. That's how important it is to him. This is the Scene de Johnny, in which he gets to tell you about all his favorite stuff. Okay, this is a regular column again. The pronounced placement of his beret in 1965 again speaks to the kind of meaning, the social meaning that's put into service as a significant aspect of young life. However, a reader's response to the previous covers illustrates this consensus among the copains themselves concerning military service. In the letters column, reader Brigitte Vernant praises the magazine's decision to put Johnny on the cover, again, but notes her, quote, sadness upon discovering Johnny in uniform on the cover, end quote. Vernon believes that Holiday looks much better in his stage attire than in a uniform and laments that he will be gone for 15 months. Additionally, other youth magazines, such as Nous les Garçons et les Filles, distinguished themselves from the dominant Salut les Copains through criticism of the political slant of Salut les Copains. In the premiere issue of 1963, the editor of Nous les Garçons et les Filles, Christian Eckhard, presented his magazine as a counterbalance to what he perceived as the Gaullist tendencies of Salut les Copains, and in the same issue published a piece against obligatory service. Youth perceptions of the military then remain unclear, with youth media providing conflicting sentiments. Nevertheless, Holliday's tour of duty was heralded as significant within the pages of Salut les Copains, and he continued his column La Lettre de Johnny. I think I have that. The next one. Here we are. La Lettre de Johnny. Between April of 1964 and 1965, in which he would report on his activities in Offenburg. These columns were addressed directly to the magazine's readers in a style similar to other columns that emphasized the friendship between the idols and their fans. Youth magazines in the 1960s, they foster a connection between the listeners and performers through a discourse that stressed community between young people, the copains, with shared beliefs, values, and experiences. And in his April 1964 letter to Salut les Copains, Holliday speaks of a new life beginning with service and celebrating with his copains. While in August 1964 letter reveals Holliday's success in the military. Quote, "Perhaps I am not a good soldier, if you believe the traditional maxim of the Army, which is that a good soldier should be punished at least one time." I think Holliday kind of got it easy in the Army, to be honest here. He then speaks of what his service has given him. Quote, "An inner peace, a moral equilibrium," end quote. And Holliday then denounced the negative press surrounding his military service in the French Journaux à Scandale for questioning his commitment to the military. Holliday was reacting to a general perception of young people as rebellious and violent, noting that he instead was, quote, "trying to complete his service peacefully," end quote. Holliday observed that his service gave him new perspectives on youth culture and noted that it was important as a part of national unity. The September 1964 letter, however, reveals that during his tour he managed to write some new songs. One of the tensions evident in the coverage by Salut les Copains was the issue of personal transformation, the idea of military as a method of maturation. You know, if it's youth culture, you don't want to grow up, right? Holliday was central to the success of the yay phenomena, but now by fulfilling his duty, it created a question to whether or not he would be the same Copain after his tour of duty. And in a sense, during this period, it allowed him, the military allowed him to continue to record songs, perhaps for use of his image. And one of his most famous ones, this would be the next one here, is Le Pénitencier, one of his celebrated classics, which was released with him in uniform on the cover. So the idea here is that, indeed, his time in the military did show a shift away from his earlier sound towards a newer sound. And certainly this agreement reveals that the military itself realized the potential benefit of Holliday as a way of promoting a positive image after Algeria. The manufactured nature of the coverage illuminates how Salut les Copains wanted to present obligatory service to its young readers as somewhat of a transformative experience, while at the same time a necessary experience. In the case of Holliday, the recasting of the Army after the controversies of decolonization emphasized its more traditional role in French society as a crucible for youth to become men. Yet this media campaign would, in a sense, become a moot point as Pierre Mesmer began reforms of the Army to move away from the reliance on conscripts. And by the 1970s, obligatory service had lost this traditional meaning and would eventually cease by the end of the 20th century. Nevertheless, the coverage of Soldat Smet reminds us that this outcome was not a given, and that the opportunity to target young readers was important to renewing the prestige of the Army and French society. And before I lose all of my time here, I wanted to show kind of one more clip. I think it's the next one. Okay, so there is a news coverage of Holliday's service here, and I think if you just kind of click on it here, it should play. No, I guess not. Okay, so this is a coverage on the nightly news here, and here, let me see if I can get it to work here.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. All right, here we go. So this is Holliday's regiment here. Thank you.